Hi, this is Sean Hafer, and in this tutorial, we'll be looking at shape layers in After Effects, what they are, and what are some of the ins and outs of using shape layers in your projects. All right, so I'm going to start off with a new composition. I'm here in After Effects, just in my default setting, and we'll hit New Composition. Let's come over here, and let's just call this one Shape Layers. And I'm going to do a 1280 by 720, 30 frames a second is fine. And background color, I've got a light blue there. So what are shape layers? So shape layers are similar to masks, except they have stroke and fill capabilities, just like a vector drawing program such as Illustrator. And there's also a lot of different operators you can use on top of shape layers to create some really cool, interesting effects. There are a couple different ways we can create a shape layer. We can come up here to our sort of shape layer tools here. So we've got our ellipse tool. We can pull down here, rectangle tool, rounded rectangle tool, ellipse, polygon, and star tool. So before you start drawing, if you're getting ready to go, you can always hit Q to toggle through those different shapes. Let's go to our first one, rectangle tool. So before I start drawing, I'm going to go ahead and click up here and see what we've got as options. So we've got our fill and stroke. So if I click on fill the word, you can see if we want no fill, a solid color, a linear gradient, and then a radial gradient. Here would be if you know right off the bat you're going to use a blending mode, you can select that here, but I'm going to keep mine normal. And then the opacity, if you know right off the bat what opacity you want. And I'm going to go ahead and also then click a solid fill and hit OK. Now to select the color of that fill, what you want to do is just come right here and click on that actual swatch. So then we can come in here and go to our RGBs, our HSVs, however you want to do it. And let's just go ahead and say, grab a dark blue. And we can hit OK. Same thing goes for stroke. Click on the word, you get no stroke, stroke, solid, etc. Opacity, the same setting. So we'll go with solid stroke. You can say how many pixels you want it. So I'm going to go 10. And you can pick your color by clicking on the swatch. So if I came in here just for some contrast, let's go for a little sort of purpley magenta vibe. All right. So now if I can click and drag, and if I hold down Shift, it will restrain to a square. And then we've got our shape layer. Let's look at what happens over here once we create a shape layer. So by default, it will create a layer called shape layer. So if you wanted to change the name of this, you could hit enter. Maybe it's blue square. And we can go there. If we roll this open, we can see we've got a contents folder. Inside that contents, we've got a rectangle. Shape layers are kind of like a series of groups. You can sort of nest different parts and attributes of the shape layer or shape layers inside of one layer. Just like with a mask where you can have multiple masks on one layer, the same thing can happen with shape layers. So if we look here, we've got contents, we've got our rectangle. If I turn that off, that whole shape layer goes off. We've got the rectangle path. So again, that is creating the shape, so we can see the size here. We can see its position. Okay, now there's multiple positions here. So this is its position of just its path inside of this rectangle group. And I'm going to take that back to 0. We can see then we also have a roundness option. So if we want to round those corners, we can come in here and round those corners. Any of these things can be animated that have the stopwatch. So now if we roll down further, we can see we've got a stroke and open that up. And we can see here we've got its composite. Where is it? Below previous and same group or above previous and same group, right? So here we're not going to see any difference, but if we change that in the fill, we will. We've got our color again, same as up here. These work together. Opacity, stroke width. Then we've got line cap and line join. So again, this is a straight line, so there's not too much here that we could look at. the miter limit. We could also add dashes. So if we came in here and we wanted to add a dash, kind of like Illustrator, we could say, all right, I want a dash. And right now you can see, I'm going to zoom in a little up here. Our dash is 10 pixels. And there's the offset. So if you needed to move this a certain way, you could do that. Again, that could be easily animated if you just want dots moving around the outside of a shape. We can also come in here and add a gap. So if you wanted to have a separate gap distance, then you could have your dashes and your gaps have different lengths. So once we have these dashes in here, now we can come up here and look at our options for our butt cap. So if we look here and change it from butt cap to round cap, you can see now we have a rounded edge on our stroke. We could come in here and add that, and then we can see we've got those rounded kind of dashes for a softer look, especially with this rounded rectangle. Now, if we look at the fill below, okay, so we've got all these dashes, so I can go ahead and close up my stroke here. And if we want to turn it off, we can just hit that eyeball. And you can see the stroke is lying on top of our shape. It's not like Illustrator where we can have our stroke inside or outside of the path. But what we can do is we can move that stroke above or below. If I take my fill here and drag that on top of my stroke, now you can see my fill is cutting off my stroke. It's covering it. And if I turn off the fill, you can see the stroke is still there, but it's just covering it. So that order of operations really applies in shape layers. So it's something you want to pay attention to. So if I came down to my fill and look at the options here, we have, again, this idea of above previous or below previous. So that's another way you can change it without moving them in the actual layer order. We have our color here and we have our opacity. So if we wanted, slight opacity, we could do that. Then you'll see down here we have the transforms for this rectangle. So I'm going to zoom back out so we can see our full comp. By drawing this out here, I automatically set its position out here to -2443 and then -61.6. So if I went and zeroed those out, now you can see we're centered up. And we'll get more into the anchor points and different ways we can change those throughout this tutorial, but that is one thing to look out. So this position here can give you a position of just the rectangle. Then we've got this rectangle group ahead on top of it that this sits in, and that has its own transform where we could change position as well. So there's a lot of options inside shape layers, and they can get a little confusing, but we'll try and keep moving through it step by step so that it makes sense at the end here. Just like in masks, if we have a shape layer selected up at its top layer level, and we go ahead and say, create an ellipse, and I click and drag and maybe hold down Shift again, holding Shift when you're drawing an ellipse. Holding Control will draw it from the center. So if we create that, I've got a circle. It'll hold the same stroke and fill from the previous one. And now if I come over here and we look, it's created this ellipse inside of this blue square layer. It doesn't really make sense to call this a blue square layer anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and change this name just to shape layer group. So if we look here now, we've got our ellipse. We can go ahead and grab that. If we go hit V for our selection tool, we could drag that here. And you can see, just like our normal layers, if it is above the rectangle one, it will go on top. And if it's below, it will go below. So let me go into ellipse. And while this is selected, I could just say, let's change that fill to something so we can see it's different. That looks good. And that's just so we can really tell. Okay, so we've got these here. Now, again, if we look into our ellipse options, we've got our path and our stroke, just like before. We have our fill, just like before. And then we have a transform for our ellipse. So if we roll down, we have our transform for our rectangle and a transform for our ellipse. So if we look in here, We can look its position. Same thing, if we do 0 tab 0, that'll center it up. And if this was on top, let me drag it up above rectangle, you can see now those are centered up. If I wanted to move the entire thing, if I go to my shape layer group, this transform will adjust everything. So if we decided, to move the position here, if we were going to scale the whole thing, all of this is moving together. If we wanted to have the ellipse doing its own thing, then that would be inside just its ellipse transform. So you could have things animating inside of your basic shape, and then the other thing animating, and then your top layer animating as well. It's almost like a pre-composition, a pre-comp, but it's a little different because it's just vector shape layers. So that's how the basics of shape layers. Now, we could also still mask a shape layer. So if I have the shape layer group selected, and if I come up here and click on my shape tool, and you can see here, it's got a little star, tool create shapes, and next to it is tool creates masks. So now if I draw, you can see the icons differently. It's now drawing a mask on top of our shape layer. And the same thing happens with other masks. We've got our contents, right? So in here, this layer, we've got a new masks layer or little group, and there's our mask one. And we could do everything we wanted, the same thing we do with our masks. We can move, we can invert, all of those things as well. So if you do, you can still mask a shape layer. So even though it's the same tool, basically, the big difference is when you're using this, just make sure you're on Tool Creates Mask or Tool Creates Shape. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that masks. All right, we're back to here. And you also have the other options here. So we have our polygon tool. And if we came in here and started drawing, if you hold down Shift, it will draw sort of flat. And we've got a polygon. If we come inside of here, it's called Polystar. And then we've got Polystar Path, same thing. We've got our stroke. We've got our fill. And then the same thing, its own transforms. Now in this Polystar, though, we can select how many points we have. So if we needed a stop sign, we could, hit 8. If we wanted something like a 12-sided object, we could come in there and do all of that as well. So points is the big one, and we also have an outer radius and an outer roundness. So this will sort of start rounding it up to a circle. You can see if I go backwards, it starts creating some weirdness. So you can really start getting into some strange things with some of these shape layers and create some really wacky shapes. So I'm going to bring my outer roundness back to 0. And then we've got our outer radius. So all of these things can also be animated if for some reason you wanted to animate the number of points. Remember, anything with a stop sign gives you that ability. Our last tool up here would be our star tool. And same thing, click and drag, hold down Shift if you want it upright. You can move this one. With the Polystar, we can see of the Polystar path. We have how many points. And the big difference here is we've got our inner radius and outer radius. So you can create some varied shapes here. So if you get too confused when you're drawing, sometimes these lines can really get distracting. Remember, you can always come down here and toggle your mask and shape visibility so you can really see what they look like. And you might want to toggle your transparency grid as well. So the star, similar things. Coming in here, again, you've still got your stroke, fill, all of that option. Here we could see we're in around this. We could start to create that inner rounding as well as, again, just doing some crazy different shapes. Right? So if you need a flower, there you go. So there's a lot of interesting things we can do with these just at their defaults by playing with those. And again, to really feel those, it's best just to play around and figure that out on your own just by practice. I mean, because there's so many different things. All right, so far we've drawn out all of these. So let's create a new composition. And we'll just call it Shape Layer 02. Everything else is fine. So you can also create a shape layer by just double clicking on your tool. So if we came in here, we went to our rectangle tool, we decided to maybe turn off the fill by clicking on the name, no fill. And if we just double click it, it's going to create one that is the size of our comp. So you can see we've got shape layer 1 down here in our contents, rectangle 1. If we roll down that into our path, we can see 1280 by 720. So if you wanted to, you could come in here and scale it down. You know it's centered up. You don't have to go into the position to get it centered. You can click on the link if you say you wanted something that was 200, 200. Now, if we want to keep this as a square, we can always click that link again to link the two values, and we're good here. So that's another way to do it. A third way is to come in here, layer, and again, I'm deselecting shape layer 1 so I can have a fresh one. But I could go layer, new, shape layer. Now there's nothing here. I'm going to hide shape layer 1. Okay, so there's nothing here. If I roll this down, the contents are empty. But you can see we've got this little add with a little arrow, and we also have that up here. So if I come in here and I say add, now I could add different groups. We could add a rectangle, ellipse, polystar, or a path, fill, stroke, gradient fill, gradient stroke, and then some of these operators down here, which we'll get to in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and add an ellipse. And we can see here, it just adds an ellipse path. So we don't have a stroke. We don't have a fill. So if I come in here again, go to my ellipse path, I can see it's 100 by 100. And I'm going to now add a stroke. If we come down here, we can see what it is. Increase it. So maybe I'm going to increase it to 10. Color of white, that's fine for now. If I wanted to have a fill, I could then come in here and do the same thing. Stroke, so be on my ellipse path, add, fill. And while that's selected, I could just click up here and go for whatever I want and hit OK. And you can see it added the fill. So again, if I zoom in here, the fill and the stroke, we can move those around. So if I move the stroke above the fill, that stroke width is centered on that shape, but it extends over. So right now that stroke is 10, I believe. Yep, 10 pixels. So that means there's 5 outside, 5 inside. If we drag that stroke below the fill, then we're really getting a 5 pixel stroke outside. So if I hide this fill, you can see that stroke is still 10, but only 5's coming through. And that's another way you can create your shapes, by just adding them bit by bit this way. So if I come back here, and while we've got this one, so let's just select shape layer 2, and let me draw in with the same fill and stroke, I'll just draw in a rectangle. So I'll hold down shift so it becomes a square. And there we go. So you can see since I had that selected, I now have rectangle 1 here, ellipse path 1 here. And it's got the same stroke and fill as we had there. So now let's look at some of our other operators here. So I could come in here with this selected, and add a merge paths. So this is somewhat like the pathfinder in Illustrator. So if I come, I've got my merge paths here. If I roll this down, we've got mode add. So if I go to my view selection tool, I grab rectangle 1, you can now see, and again, I'll turn off my path visibility. So now you can see we're getting a merge. Now, if I'm on rectangle 1, I can just move that around. But if I'm on my shape layer and I move, we're dragging the whole thing. So it's really powerful, but it can be really confusing. So it's sometimes you just really need to double check what you're selecting. So if we come down to our merge paths, we've got mode add, we could do subtract, right? So now it is subtracting ellipse from rectangle. So again, the order matters. So if I switch these two, now it's selecting the rectangle from the ellipse. So whatever's on top, the one below is being subtracted or added or whatever to it. Okay. If we come down here again, merge paths, and instead of subtract, we could do intersect. And now it's just that intersection. And then the last one, exclude intersections. So we've got that shape. So it's like the Pathfinder tool, but it's parametric. So it's live. So that's the cool thing about it, is that you could keep these things. So with ellipse path 1, we could come in here and then we could still move, animate our position here, right? And just go through however we want to do. Same with the rectangle, move that and animate that separately. Okay, so that's the merge paths. And you can continue adding more. You can even merge groups. Let's delete this shape layer 2. And let's create a little more complex shape. So what I'm going to do is start off with, get rid of that shape layer. And I'm going to go to my star tool. And let's pick a couple colors before we create it. So let's go with something like maybe a light gray. And on our stroke, let's give it sort of a grayish blue. And now I'm going to go ahead and create a star. Hold down Shift. And I'm going to go ahead and go to my transform, polystar 1, and we are going to put that at 0, 0 in the position. Now what we want to do is let's change this polystar. So we're going to create a bunch of different shapes in here and use some merge paths to create a gear shape. But what I want to do is name this our gear grouping. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And not my main shape layer, but just under where it says polystar 1. I'll call it gear grouping. So now what we want to do with this selected, we're going to add an ellipse. So I'm going to just go in here, add ellipse. Okay, and it created that right inside. So you can see here inside of gear grouping, we've got polystar path, and now we have ellipse path. So I can come in here, and you can see this does not have a stroke or a fill. It is taking the stroke and fill from the stroke and fill that are outside down below. So polystar path, since we created that one first and it created the stroke and fill, now if we create others inside of that polystar, they will adopt these stroke and fills. If you want them to have their own, you could just create more stroke and fills and put them inside their own groups. But in this case, we'll just keep one stroke and fill on the outside, and that should do everything we need. So now we've got this ellipse path. I'm going to roll down, look at its size, and let's crank it out to about 450. Seems good. And that's going to cut off the ends of our points. Now, 5 pointed gears doesn't seem like a lot, So let's go back up into our polystar path, and maybe let's change that up to points to 10. Okay, great. I'm going to roll these both up so we can see what we've got happening. So again, we've got our gear grouping. That was our original polystar, and we changed the name. And then inside that, it's got its path and its stroke and fill and its transform. But then what we did is added from inside here with that selected an ellipse, and that created an ellipse path, but it's still using the stroke and fill and that transform from that group. So we've got that happening. Okay, now I'm going to use this circle to cut off the tips of that star. So with gear grouping selected, I'm going to add a merge paths. You can see it comes in right here. And what we want to do here is do intersect. And now it's selecting just the intersection. And these are still editable. So if you want to add a little more height or points or anything, any of these things can be changed along the fly. So if we say we want 12, if we only want 9, whatever you want to do, you can do that on the fly, which is what's really great about these. So we've got a polystar path, we've got our ellipse path, and we've got a merge paths in here. So what I want to do now is get rid of this little angle inside here, because in a gear, that would be kind of rounded as well. So we need to create another ellipse. So with this selected gear group, we want to add an ellipse again. We want to drag this below our merge paths. Then we can scale that up by rolling down here to see the size. And let's just scale that up so it's a little bit outside these points here. All right. So now again, with gear grouping selected, add, and we're going to add another merge paths. So remember, the order that these are in, our layers, are how these work. So if I bring this up, drag this down below ellipse path 2, and it's by default on add. And now you can see, turn this off, we've got our merged path doing an addition on top of all of these up here. So now let's put a hole in the middle of our gear. So again, gear grouping. Guess what we're doing? We're adding an ellipse. And let's drag this all the way down. Again, below merge paths. This will be our cutout hole. I'm going to come in here, maybe make that a little bigger. And let's create one more merge path. So again, inside of this gear grouping. Now, if you accidentally created, if you had it up here and you did an add merge paths, and it gets outside of here, that's totally fine. You can just bring it in yourself and drag it in and just put it below that ellipse path 3. And what are we going to do on this one? We're going to do a subtract. So now you can see we've got this gear and everything is adjustable. Everything is still vector. If we zoom in on this, it's going to stay nice and crisp. Or if we scale it up, it's going to say nice and crisp. And all of these together under gear grouping, you can use that transform if you wanted to rotate this. So if I set a rotation keyframe here and then maybe move forward 3 seconds, then I could always set a rotation of 1. And now we'll have this gear rotating. If we wanted it moving or scaling, same thing. We could come in here and scale all of it together that way. Again, you could do that also here with your object inside of the shape layers transformations as well. So if you need to do that, there's options here as well. So you could, however you want to work, but you could have a bunch of small groupings inside of one shape layer and then animate those together. So if you had maybe wheels turning and a car bouncing up and down as a separate layer, then you could move the whole shape layer as one across the screen. Okay, so we've got that. So that's the merge layers, a little bit of some of the others. So let's look at a few of the other operators real quick. So if we come into new comp, what is called the shape operators. And that's all fine. Hit OK. So in this one, we're going to go up, create our text, grab our text tool, and we're going to come into here and create some text. So I'm going to do shape and select it. Come over here. See what we've got. So we've got shape, any font you want, and we'll go ahead and just set that up there. And let's go over to our layer. We're going to select it, go up to layer, create shapes from text. So now if we roll down here, we can see we've got our shape outlines, which is now a shape layer. We've got our old text, which is shape, and it's been automatically turned off. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete that. We don't need that now. We've got shape outlines. And if I roll this down, we've got our contents. We've got an S, an H, an A, a P, and an E. I'm going to turn our transparent background on. So we've got a fill built in, and I'm going to select all these. With all of this selected, I'm going to come up here, click on my word fill here, and turn that off. And hit OK. And now I'm going to take I'm going to come into my shape layer here, and I'm just going to add a stroke. So that'll come down here. And now let's make that maybe a darker color. So it's a black maybe. And give it some width. And again, since this is below all of our layers here, are S, H, A, P, and E, you can see we've got that. So I'm going to turn that background back on. We can look at it, there's shape. Now, if you look at something like this A or the P, it'll have two shapes inside, and it automatically created a merge paths for us, right? So it is doing a merge of this inner shape and this outer shape of the A. So it does all that for us. All those can be animated. But with a trim path, what we were talking about before, what a trim path does, so what I want to do is let's draw a quick line. Now I want to make sure I don't have shape outline selected, or it'll create that in that same shape layer. So I'm going to click out here to deselect everything, go to my pen tool, then I'm just going to hold down Shift to create a straight line. And we can see here we've got a stroke of 25. That's fine, whatever you want to do. And that looks good. So if I roll this down, I can come in here to my shape one. You can see I've got a path and a stroke, and I can see all those options. Now with this shape layer selected, I'm going to hit enter and call it line. We're going to add a trim paths. So when we come in here, add trim paths. What we now have is this trim paths operator. We've got a start and an end. It's at 0 and 100, but you can see if I drag this down, it draws on, right? And if I brought this down to 0 and this to 100, we could have it go that way as well. So however you want to work those, you can work it. So we're going to use this same trim paths on our shape layer. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this line. Go into shape outlines, same thing, contents, add, trim paths. So now we can come in here, we can do the same thing, start. And I'm going to turn off my lines there so we can see this. So now if I go to my end from 0, set a keyframe, go forward a couple seconds, and then bring that up to 100. And now we've got this sort of draw on. Okay. So with our easy ease, we can come in here and select both of those and either F9 or right click Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. Now that'll give us a little ease in and a little ease out. Now you'll see another option here. You have trim multiple shapes either simultaneously or you can also do individually. So if we came in here, now it'll do it across the way for you. So that's the basics of a trim path. If you had a shape that had a fill, so if I came in here and let's add our fill, add fill, and we'll just, this red is fine. And let's throw that there. Now the thing that you'll see is it's filling a straight line between the shapes. So it's usually trim paths are best without a fill. Now what you could do, we could always have the fill at 0 opacity. Maybe set a keyframe. We'll move forward. And then as that's drawn on, we could always then set a keyframe and then fade up that opacity as a little secondary motion. So you could draw it on first, right? And then fade in. So you don't want to do a filled shape with a trim path. All right, let's look at some of the other operators. So we come into our composition, new composition. Again, same thing. And let's create a polygon. Just going to draw it out, move it up, and let's see what we've got. So let's give it a fill. Give it a solid fill. And actually, that's fine. Okay, so we've got a little polygon here. Let's see what else we've got. So again, if we did a merge or we did merge paths already, offset paths, what that does is it just basically offsets the path. It doesn't change the shape of the actual line. So if we come in here and amount, you can see our shape's still there, but it's offsetting the path. And then you can add some copies. So if you wanted to do some kind of dramatic tunnel effect, you could use something there. And then you can also offset those copies, right? So you could have that come in and come out. So another really fun thing there with offset paths. So I'm going to delete that one. Let's check our next one. You could go to add, pucker and bloat. So pucker and bloat is kind of, I think that's in Photoshop as well, in Illustrator. So it basically is just an effect. So you have this pucker and bloat vibe, create some weird shapes, do some weird things. And again, those are all animatable. All right, that's pucker and bloat. I can delete that one. Let's add our next one, which is repeater. So what a repeater does is, as you can see, it repeats. So we can come in here and there's basically copies. And if I drag this sort of over, you can see there's copies. There's offset. So again, how far it's offset from the original path. We also have composite below or above. Okay, so whether they're coming and being created on top or below. And then the transform repeater. And we're going to do something in our next little example that digs more into this. But you can see by changing things such as the position. And then we can also, if we change X and then Y, we've got things moving. Let me scale this one down so we can see more of these. Okay, so I scaled that down. You could see that with that repeater, we've got scale. So again, it could get larger on the way through. It could get smaller, right? So all that could happen. You've got rotation. So again, it's the total amount of rotation as it moves through, and start opacity and end opacity. So things could fade in or fade out, right? That way. So that's the repeater, and you can do a lot of really cool things with repeaters. So let's say we want to create a grid. So what we could do is, let me go ahead and kill this repeater since we got it all crazy. And we've got this little guy here, and I'm going to scale it down a little bit. Hold shift. All right, so we've got that scaled down, and let's just come back up here to our shape layer and add a repeater. So what I could do is come into my repeater, and I want to, let's do 6 copies, and we'll come into the repeater transform properties, and on the X, let's spread it out. So let's get these all the way out here. So right now mine's at about 734, but just spread it out so it looks good. Now, if I wanted more rows of this, again, with this selected, I could just go ahead, add a new repeater, or I could Command D or Control D to duplicate. So let's try it that way. We haven't done that yet. So let's Command or Control D. So we've got a second repeater. And if I come in here and go to my transform repeater 2, let's make the X 0, and let's crank the Y up a little. All right, so that's too many copies. So maybe we'll take this down to 4. And now you could see we could create a grid. And by just taking our main one, we can move that wherever. And that's sort of an array. And you could animate any of these things as far as them coming out, etc. But where it can get really fun is when we start adding some other things. So let's say, so now let's add a wiggle transform. So I'm going to come up here, add wiggle transform, and let's move this down below. So we've got our polystar, we've got our wiggle transform. Now in here, there's nothing happening yet. So I went ahead and let's bring our preview area down so it'll repeat. So I'm going to go ahead and just have this playing and looping. And now we can see here, it's got some presets built in, but what I want to do is roll down the transform under wiggle transform. So here, if I say, let's make that 10, you can now see randomly, it's moving up to 10 pixels on the X. If I made that 20, now up to 20 pixels on the X. So if we wanted to add a little Y, let's go ahead and do a 10. So now we've got up and down motion, right? Happening. No keyframes. And then we can come over here to scale. Let's say we wanted to maybe scale 10% up and down. All right, so we've got a little growth happening there. Then what about rotation? Let's give it 90 degrees possible rotation. So now you've got all of these really interesting shapes for maybe some kind of background. Maybe we take that down to 30. But you can create some really interesting randomized background here. And then up here, you could start changing some of the different phases, temporal phase and spatial phase. And again, this is one of those things of really playing with it to see what you can get going. Wiggles per second, maybe make it 0.5. So it's a real subtle motion. Okay, so that's the wiggle transform. Now, if we go into, let's go ahead and just delete this guy. If we go into a new shape, let's say, let's do a star. I'll just click and drag, hold down Shift, V key to grab it. We'll just center it up close. Now let's look at a couple of the other ones we haven't touched also. So we can come in here. Now there's also wiggle paths. So now you can see what happens here is a similar thing. It just wiggles your path. And we've got some options in here. If we look at wiggle paths, the size of the wiggle, right? So if you just want a little bit, you can get it really, really crazy. How much detail? So again, how many sort of wiggles, frequency almost of that. Wiggles per second, same thing as before. We can make that 0.5, slow it down. Correlation is how much it's close to the original shape versus how distorted it can get. So if we do correlation of 100%, it's going to really try and keep it the same. You can see our points get a little funky. But if we start bringing that down, you can see it allows itself to deform more. I'm going to bring this detail down to like 5 again. So we can see that. So that's wiggle paths, right? So that's kind of doing what the wiggle transform does, but only to a path, right? Let me go ahead and delete that. Let me do an add. We can also look at twist. Twist does what you think it would. It basically just gives you an angle. So you can twist that and then where that centers from, right? So you could do some weird things here. So twist. Round corners does what you would think it does, rounds the corners. So it gives you some options on something like this. And you can see it also does the sort of inner as well. So you can get some much softer shapes with round corners. And I think that's about it. Let's see. Offset pass, repeater, round corners, trim pass, twist, zigzag. So zigzag is similar to our wiggle, but let's look at our options. So let me bring the stroke down a little bit. And we can see what's happening is it's giving us an ordered zigzag. Ridges per segment. So if I brought that down to 5. But then we also have a smooth, and then that gives us a really nice wavy look. So this can be really useful for if you need a line. So if we took a line and gave that the zigzag, if you need a certain waviness, so for some water perhaps, or something like that, we could come in here very easily and make that smooth and give it a little higher and get rid of that fill for sure. There we go. So if you needed a sine wave, things like that, you could do some really cool things. All right, so that's zigzag. So one last thing I'll do is when we're looking at the repeater, let's do one more example and create some sort of simple stylized fireworks. So I'm going to do a new comp. And actually, let's go with something a little darker. Let's do a sort of a nighttime sky. And we could do a gradient here, but that's fine. All right, so let's talk about the repeater again. So we did the repeater in a sort of vertical and horizontal manner, but let's talk about what we can do with rotation. Okay, so now I'm going to come in here and let's create a line. I'm going to use my proportional grid here. So I'm going to turn that on. And then what I'm going to do is go to my pen tool, go to stroke, maybe make that about 18. And I think it's a white color here is fine. So I'm going to go to my center here and click. I'm going to hold down shift and then click up maybe about to here. All right, that looks good. So now we can come in here and let's look at what we've got. So we've got our shape layer. Our anchor point is right here from where I started it. So that looks good. And we can now roll this down and add a repeater. So with the repeater added, so we don't want it to be a horizontal vertical type of repeat. We want it to be an array, so a long rotation. So what I'm going to do is come in here, go to my transform repeater 1, click on my rotation here, and we can say, let's go 30. And now you can see that's starting to go. Now the thing is, so I'm going to come down here in the position, make that 0. So now we've got our 3, they're all lined up. I'm going to do 12 copies. We are at our position of 0, 0. That's great. Scale, all of that is fine. But on rotation, I want to do an array. So if I start dragging this out, you can see it starts creating our shape. You can try and eyeball this, but the easiest way to do it is just say, I've got 360 total degrees, and then divided by, so use my /12 copies. And that'll give us our 30 degrees there. So that's ready to go. Okay, now what we can do is what we're going to want this to happen. So since this repeat is happening, everything is set up at its center. We can come in here to our shape, look at its position. Now as we hit Y, you can see it's going out from its center and creating that little burst for us. So what we could do is let's undo this, is we're going to want to have this burst up and it's going to scale and then move out apart. So I'm going to start out at 0 frames, actually, and we're going to come into our transform shape 1, turn on our scale, and then turn on our position and also our opacity. So as I'm going to start with my scale down, very small, so let's say 10%, our opacity at 0%, and our position as is. And now if I move forward, maybe 1 second, we're going to bring our opacity up to 100. We're going to bring our scale up to 100. And let's bring our position on the Y to negative, I'm going to go 185. So now if I rewind and play this back, we get a nice little burst. Okay, so that's pretty slow, but we can speed that up here in a second. So then also what I'm going to want to do is as those come up, maybe there, we want them to fade out as they're still moving. So maybe here, let's move that keyframe back to 100%, and then they're fading out back to 0. See how that feels. All right. So I'm going to grab these keyframes by marquee selecting them, move them a little forward. See what we got. All right. And we can always grab these guys here, F9, or give them a little easy ease. So we grab those. Keyframe assistant, easy ease. And let's see how that feels. Okay, that feels a little better. Let's scoot them in a little bit closer. And one other thing we could do here is we could come in and look at our stroke and give it a, let me turn off that grid now. We don't need that anymore. We could give those a little round edge. So we come into our butt cap, make that a round cap. And then maybe that stroke width, if we want, we could give it a little more boost. We could even animate that up if we wanted, but I think that's okay. So there's that. So then we've got, boom. All right, so maybe that's our first one. Now what we could do is just come in here and let's say, hit enter, white burst, and then let's go ahead and Command or Control D to duplicate that. Hit enter. Let's make this red burst. And we can look at this. Let's just move forward in time. And let's have this red one up here somewhere. So I'm just going to go to my tool here, grab red burst, and let's just drag it up here. And what's nice is with this, we can easily just come in, since it's selected, click on that, make that red. And we could also maybe make this one a little smaller. So we could say red burst, and it's transformed down here. Since we're not scaling the overall, right, we're only scaling it inside the actual stroke, we could come down here and just scale that down a little bit so we get a smaller burst. And then we could come in here, just offset that a little bit. Boom, boom, right? So we've got those guys. And maybe we even want to give that less or more lines. So we could come in here too and say red burst. Let's look at your contents. Your repeater, let's give it 16. And remember, we have to come down to our transform on the rotation, make that 360 divided by 16. Let's see what we get. Right, so now, okay, we get those exciting bits and maybe one more copy. Make this one green. Green burst. And do the same thing. Come into where we can see it. Copied it, drag it over here. And we could come into our contents. First off, let's make it green. And let's make that scale a little bit. Let's get a little bigger on this one. 125. And nudge that whole thing over a little. And now we've got, all right, so we've got super exciting little bursts. They could be fireworks. They could be something for icons popping on. Any of these kind of things can happen. And let's just see how that goes a couple times. Boom, boom, boom. And again, playing with your different easings can add that, and sizes of your strokes and all of that. So that is our repeater, and I think how that works. So this has been a long one, but again, in this we've gone through the different operators inside of shape layers. We've gone through the 5 types of shape layers, right? We've got ellipse, rectangle, polygon, and the star. We can also draw in our shapes with a pen tool, just like our masks. Fill and stroke options are all in there. We can do multiples of each. They can apply to everything, or they can apply just to individual. You can think about shape layers as groups, and the order of those groups definitely apply to how things are applied down the line. So remember that with strokes and fills and merges and all of those different things. We drew on some text with the trim paths, and we used the repeater to create sort of a linear array as well as a circular array with our little fireworks here at the end. And then we also used our merge paths to create a complex shape with that gear. So hopefully you enjoyed this and you found it useful. And if you have any questions, let me know. And thanks for watching.